welcome today, Marines and family members. My name is Dr. Ed Novgosky. I'm the director of the Marine Corps History Division, as well as the Chief of Marine Corps History. In that position, my responsibility is I run the Marine Corps History Division that's over on Main Side. It's not connected to the Marine Corps Museum. We're a separate organization. We like to call the museum the 3D part of Marine Corps history. See the stuff that you can actually, touch and feel and kind of observe. The Marine Corps History Division is the 2D. We are the historians, and we have all the official documents and primary source materials for research. In my role as the Chief of Marine Corps History, I am the Commandant of the Marine Corps' personal historian. So if he has a question about Marine Corps history, he fires off an email or a text message or something to me, or his staff gets in touch with me. So just heard from the Commandant this morning. He actually sent me a happy birthday email and wishes anyone that I come across to extend a happy birthday to Marines and family members. So with me today, I have to my left here Dr. Craig Swanson, who teaches at the Marine Corps Command and Staff College aboard Quantico at Marine Corps University. Dr. Swanson is a retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel, received his PhD in history, American history, and he is an avid researcher and writer of Marine Corps history. His area of expertise is the Pacific War, or the Pacific Theater War during World War II, with particular emphasis on the Navy and Marine Corps. To my right, I have Dr. Frank Kolesnik. Dr. Kolesnik and I work together. He is my chief historian at the Marine Corps History Division. He has he's a retired major in the Marine Corps, received his PhD from Florida State, and he has taught at a number of different universities. He was the command historian for the Marine Special Operations Command down at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina for a little over 7 years before he joined the History Division as the chief historian. And the way you kind of look at the chief historian with the director is kind of the guy that runs things, makes decisions, goes forward with ideas and projects. He's typically going to be a little bit younger. The chief is the old grizzled, salty one who's seen everything and done everything and keeps the director in line. So kind of look at it as the commander and the sergeant major here in many ways. But no, Frank's our chief historian, and he's the one that keeps the troops in line and keeps us pushing in the right direction as far as priority resources in researching and writing Marine Corps history. And then just over on the other side is one of our newer employees at the Marine Corps History Division, Mr. Chris Blaker, who has his master's degree, his undergraduate and his master's in history. Wrote his thesis on the task organization of the Marine Corps during the Vietnam War. So he joined us, although a historian by trade, education and training, he joined the History Division as one of our core editors. But because of his background and expertise in Marine Corps history and World War II, we use him here for events like this in the more of a historian capacity. But all of us together, I received my PhD from King's College in London, in military history. I'm a retired lieutenant colonel as well. And all of us together, I think if you put us all together, we probably have well over 100 plus years of dedicated Marine Corps history in our blood. So what we'd like to do today is discuss, and it's going to be more or less a discussion with you about the Marine Corps right before World War II, and then take it all the way up to the Marianas campaign, so prior to Iwo Jima and prior to the Okinawa campaigns. In February, we're going to do a second discussion on Marine operations at Iwo Jima, or on Iwo Jima, and then of course Okinawa to end the war. So if anybody has any questions about anything leading up to World War II up to the Iwo Jima campaign, that's what we're here to discuss. So right off the bat, who's got a question? If not, we're going to do historians, or we're going to talk amongst ourselves and with you as kind of observers that might drive some of your questions and some of your thoughts. But to begin with, does anybody have any questions whatsoever? Is there anything that's ever been out there on your mind that you wanted to know about? Gotta be something. There, yes, sir. Going once, going twice.
Well, hopefully it will make sense. It seemed like every time we went into a conflict, we were fighting the techniques, tactics, procedures of the old one. You know, the machine gun going forward, the trench warfare, those types of things. So I'm kind of curious as what was the last conflicts, those things that went into World War II that were new and maybe not appropriate at the time as well.
Yeah. So the question is, it seems like every time Marine Corps gets into the next conflict, we tend to use the tactics, techniques, and procedures and the doctrine from the previous conflict. Going into World War II, what was the Marine Corps' experience, and I believe this is what you're asking, sir, what was the Marine Corps' most recent experience, and what kind of tactics, techniques, procedures, or doctrine did we utilize going into the war that was most appropriate or least appropriate?
A little of both, because I think there was some lessons learned in the early fights too.
Absolutely, sir. So both least and most appropriate. I'll start off by saying that going into World War II, the Marine Corps had been an innovative force for the previous decade plus, probably more like 2 decades. So we get into World War II, the Marine Corps anyway, starting to focus on it 42, 43, focused in 41, 42, entered 42, 43 on the ground. Much of our experience up to that point had been ship's guards, securing naval bases. That encompassed our role in the 1700s all throughout the 1800s. It's not till the late 1800s the Marine Corps, a little bit in Civil War, Mexican-American War. It's really not until the Spanish-American War at the turn of the century that Marines are starting to fight in tactical organizations much like the Army. We're coming off the ships and we're fighting as platoons, as companies, as dedicated units, not like patchwork quilts. The 1st Marine Battalion that you'll actually see fighting where it's a dedicated battalion is Colonel Huntington's 1st Battalion that'll land at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And it'll fight as a dedicated battalion, a little bit smaller than we know a battalion to be today, but it's going to have 4 companies. You're going to have captains or lieutenants as company commanders. Huntington's a lieutenant colonel. And that's really our first experience fighting tactically like that. World War I, out of necessity, will deploy 2 brigades of Marines, several thousand Marines, 10, 15, 20,000 Marines rotating through. And we will fight as companies and battalions all the way up as a brigade of Marines, which is really a loose term at the time for a regiment. We have multiple regiments that will fight there, the 5th and 6th Marine Regiments. And we fight as a dedicated regiment. Well, once World War I ends, 1919, Marines come back. Some will stay for occupation service. We go into a period of innovation where we're starting to look at the fact that the Marine Corps is not going to be able to stay the size it is when you have the U.S. Army that's already large enough to fight all of America's ground conflicts. So what role will the Marine Corps really play? Now, out of necessity, we reinforced the Army in World War II. Same thing in the Spanish-American War. But going forward, budgets, you know, America's constant fear of having a large standing military, which is an adoption from our days as the colonies under the British. The Marine Corps focuses internally and says, what is our mission going to be? What is our purpose going to be in supporting the United States? And it gets argued back and forth in the Marine Corps Gazette and in the halls of headquarters of Marine Corps. What's our job? What's our purpose in life? It's finally the Commandant, General John A. Lejeune, that's going to say we're going to support the Advanced Base Force concept, which is the early version of amphibious warfare. We are going to be attached to the Navy like we always have been. We're going to fight as soldiers from the sea. We're going to seize advanced bases to support the fleet. We're going to defend advanced bases in support of the fleet. We are going to conduct seizure-type operations coming from the sea. That is what our mission is going to be. And we spend the 20s, the 30s, right up to the early 40s as we enter World War II, creating doctrine, purchasing equipment, educating and training Marines on what it means to be a soldier from the sea, what it means to conduct amphibious warfare. And it just so happens that while all that's going on at the strategic level, the United States is having differences politically with the Empire of Japan. And Japan, like us, is a maritime nation. And Japan has a lot of holdings in the Pacific. So it's obvious as we're developing plans to potentially counter Japanese hegemony in the Pacific, the Marines are going to play a significant role. So like every good Marine, we hitch our horse, or we hitch our cart to the strongest horse. And that horse at the time is the potential to go to war with a maritime nation that has overseas holdings. How are we going to seize those holdings? How are we then going to build up and defend those holdings against the Japanese counterattack? We're going to do it with Marines. That's how we're going to do it. But I'm going to turn that question back over to some of the experts here, see if they want to weigh in.
I've got a direct response to that. There's a doctrinal pub, you can actually go online, I forget the specific website, but it's a Marine Corps website. It's called Fighting on Guadalcanal, and it was published in 1942. You guys hear it? No. Okay. There's a doctrinal publication that came out in 1942. You can still access it on the internet through an official Marine Corps website. It's called Fighting on Guadalcanal. What happened was George Marshall sent a colonel from the War Department while the Battle of Guadalcanal was going on to interview people so they could get some tactics and tips, you know, some first-hand information that they could apply to training back in the United States as they were preparing both Army and Marine Corps troops to go into combat. And they interviewed people from the colonel level down to the PFC level in both the Army and the Marine Corps. Now, General Vandegrift wrote the introduction to the book, which basically focused on tactical fighting at the squad level. And if you know about anything about Guadalcanal, a lot of it was jungle fighting. What General Vandegrift said in his introduction, that it's no different than the days of Rogers Rangers. We're fighting just like we fought in the French and Indian War. Go figure. Now, another thing to bear in mind is, everybody ever see the movie with Spencer Tracy, Northwest Passage? That came out around 1940. That's why the Army Rangers got called Rangers. So one of the things I learned from reading this doctrinal publication is that the leadership of the Army and the Navy were watching the same movies. And if you look at Rogers Rangers, at the same time in Guadalcanal, this is when the Marine Corps stood up the Raider battalions, which are often touted as, you know, America's first special operations force, because they predated the Army Rangers by several months. Now, where am I going with this? Some of the people they interviewed in this doctrinal publication were Raiders. And I don't want to wander off too far here, but a lot of the basic tactics that you see, well, the Army Rangers today, they still use Rogers Rangers rules for fighting, sort of as a doctrinal handbook. So I guess my point with this is some things never change. Something else I'm going to throw in here is, I was attending a lecture. He was sitting right next to me at Marine Corps University a couple of weeks ago, and the commandant was talking about what the Marine Corps' future is. And one of the other faculty members sitting next to us said, well, I guess COIN, as in counterinsurgency, is dead. We're focusing on conventional warfare again. And what I'd leave you with, you know, General Vandegrift's observation in this study's introduction about, you know, it's just like the French and Indian War. Since 1607, the United States has been fighting Indians of one form or another a lot more than it's been fighting conventional opponents. And bear in mind, between World War I and World War II, they had the so-called banner wars and the banana wars in the Caribbean Basin. And a lot of the World War II future leaders in the Marine Corps, like Evans Carlson or Mike Edson, had gained a lot of the combat experience in these banana wars that they applied directly to the fighting in the Pacific.
Yeah, I'll just, go ahead.
Kind of the wider strategic environment, what was happening at the time. In the 1890s, Japan was on a quest to expand and using military means to do so. And from their perspective, it was a natural thing to do, because as they looked around the Pacific, they saw who? They saw the United States and the Philippines and Guam and Hawaii. They saw the British in Southeast Asia. They saw the Dutch, the French, all having empires. So in the 1890s, at the end of the 1890s, as the United States fights against Spain and wins additional possessions in the Pacific, that it was clear to many that the United States would eventually come into conflict with Japan. You might think about that in terms of what's going on today. The Marine Corps' most proximal experience in combat during the period in the early part of the 20th century was counterinsurgencies in places like the Caribbean and in Central America and also in China, and pure competitive warfare against the Germans in World War I. In World War I, however, Marines fought largely with Army equipment, wore Army uniforms, used Army weapons, Army doctrine, and they fought ultimately under Army officers. So at the end of World War I, the Marine Corps came out with a lot of good publicity that they had fought well, but they had to distinguish themselves from what they had done before in World War I. So in the 1920s, and especially in the early 1930s, the Marine Corps has a dual identity. What's it going to do? Is it going to go back to counterinsurgencies, or is it going to do something else? And looking at the Pacific environment, looking at the strategic and geographic environment of the Pacific, the Marine Corps and the Navy, and anything I say is the Marine Corps and the Navy, because the Marine Corps doesn't go anywhere without the Navy, and the Navy doesn't stay anywhere without the Marine Corps. So everything that's happening in the training in the 1920s, 1930s, and in the conduct of World War II is the duality of the Navy and the Marine Corps. By 1933, we have a new president in FDR. FDR establishes what he calls the good neighbor policy. His good neighbor policy is basically we're not going to militarily intervene in other sovereign countries anymore. So that role of the Marine Corps is pretty much going away. Also in 1933, the Navy formally establishes the Fleet Marine Force. It's just another force within the Navy, such as the scouting force, the submarine force, or the battle force. Here's one more component that the naval commander has available to him. The Marine Corps and the Navy in the 20s and 30s conduct all sorts of fleet exercises and landing exercises, looking at the Pacific and envisioning what war will be like in the Pacific. They have as overall guidance what was called War Plan Orange, which was war against Japan, the United States versus Japan. And that's what they play to during the 1920s and 30s. Admiral Nimitz, the supreme commander in the Pacific Ocean area in World War II, says nothing happened in the Pacific that they didn't anticipate before the war. But then he caveats that saying that the kamikazes was something that they had not anticipated while they were doing war gaming at Newport and Quantico. But the Marine Corps is very innovative. I'll give you a good example. After the Battle of Tarawa, this was the first example of an amphibious assault. This is what the Navy and the Marine Corps had envisioned what warfare in the Central Pacific would be like. While the United States was ultimately victorious in the battle, it took longer than it was supposed to take, and the casualties were much higher. So they looked at the battle very carefully and looked for lessons learned. One example, the flagship was the USS Maryland, a battleship. It doesn't look like anybody in this room is old enough to remember this, but the radios used to have glass vacuum tubes that were very fragile. Well, the moment you start firing 16-inch guns, the flagship lost much of its communications. So next time, don't use a battleship for the flagship, the command ship. Other examples included waterproofing radios and many very prosaic things, but they all incorporated all of this into after-action reports. But one of the things I think that was very interesting what they did is they had Navy civil engineers go to Tarawa after the battle, and they drew up very detailed engineering drawings of the Japanese defenses. They recreated those back in Hawaii, and the 2nd Marine Division, when they went back to rest, recuperate, and retrain for the next combat, they used those fortifications to practice on to how they were going to do it. They also built similar fortifications not far from here in Dahlgren, Virginia, which is a Navy facility used for testing naval gunfire, and they experimented to see what kind of naval gunfire was most effective against the Japanese kind of fortifications. So I think what happens in the 1920s and 30s is the Navy and the Marine Corps become organizations that are open to innovation and change. and they're open to self-examination and introspection. Say, that didn't work pretty well. The Navy, for example, was looking at carrier aviation and the vulnerability of aircraft carriers. They were looking at fleet logistics, and they were also looking at how to conduct a commerce war using submarines, something they had not anticipated at all before the war.
And I'll just add very briefly, so you mentioned what were some of the things that happened before the war that were beneficial or detrimental to Marine Corps operations. One of the very advantageous innovations that the Marine Corps had in the immediate pre-World War II period was the advent of the Defense Battalion, which are essentially regimental-sized units that were created solely for the purpose of defending these advanced bases. And you have that Marine organizations wielding 5-inch, 3-inch anti-aircraft and anti-ship guns, heavy machine guns, occasionally a company of infantry, and this is one of those innovations that you aren't able to test until you're in the thick of battle. And what's fascinating about the defense battalions is they actually ended up working very well. Wake Island and Midway are both very good examples of where defense battalions were able to hold off larger Japanese forces, in the case of Wake, to the embarrassment of the Japanese, who had to come back with a much larger force to eventually take the island. And so you have, and so as the war is continuing and the Navy and the Marine Corps are sweeping through the Central and Western Pacific, these defense battalions then evolve into anti-aircraft battalions as the war becomes more of an air war. And that's just a wonderful example, I think, of the Marine Corps innovating. And then even when they realize that something works well, they continue innovating that, because World War II is one of those conflicts that no battle was the same. It was a constantly changing campaign and conflict. And so that's a really, really good example of a positive Marine Corps innovation.
If you get down into the trenches, the Marine Corps organization, we fought at the lowest level. You have the individual fighting, and then as you come up the next level, tactical organization is the squad. Then from there, platoon, company, battalion, regiment, up the division. The fire team did not exist in World War II. During World War II, we will experiment. It's all part of harnessing the strength of the NCO and going as far down, decentralizing command and control, using good commander's intent, a good mission statement. In other words, I'm not going to tell you how to think. I'm not going to tell you what to think. Like, you're going to think this specific way. I'm going to teach you how to think, but what you actually think is going to be up to you. That is the purpose of the NCO. Lowest possible level of leadership, accomplishing the highest level mission, or at least two up, but the highest level mission that NCO can accomplish. So during the war, we will start to experiment with going down below the squad level. We create the fire team, and then we go from there. And that's still the task organization that we have today. We fought as small teams in the past, as Dr. Kolesnik mentioned. You know, the Marine Corps is rooted in small unit leadership and fighting as a small organization. We perform, and then we reinforce it. We kind of take modern technology, reinforce it, and take it to the next level in World War II. But it's a great question. Kind of got us kicked off before the war into the right direction. Who's got the next question? Yes, sir.
Didn't we also develop air-to-ground support in the Banana Wars and then perfect it going on?
Okay, question is, didn't we develop the air-ground concept, which the Marine Corps is currently today famous for, during the Banana Wars, and then kind of build and perfect, capitalize on it in World War II? So we'll do the same thing. I'll give kind of an overshoot, and then I'll hand it off to the crew here to get into the meat and potatoes. I'll say this. The Marine Corps today fights as a Marine Air Ground Task Force. We stay joined at the hips. I was an infantry officer. My job was to lead Marines on the ground. There was always an aviator somewhere close by that I could tap into to get support from aircraft above. You know, so aviators leave the cockpit, they come down to the infantry, and they are our controllers of Marine aircraft. We always use Marine aircraft to soften up targets, to shape targets, to destroy targets, to do something to where I don't necessarily have to send my infantryman into the teeth of the enemy's fire. I want to soften him up with aircraft. That's why we pay billions of dollars for aircraft and to train pilots, so we don't have to expend our blood and treasure, our young men and women, as they go forward on the ground. That is a concept that the Marine Corps invests in early in the initial years of Marine Corps aviation. In the 19s, just prior to World War I, Marine Corps starts dabbling in using aircraft. During the war, we will do that. Post-war, we'll start capitalizing on it. The use of Marine Corps aviation in support of ground troops in World War I is really by happenstance or coincidence. As we get into the Banana Wars, fighting in Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, again there, we're not tied at the hip yet, but we're recognizing that if you use aircraft to soften up enemy targets, you create a hole, a gap in which infantry can move through and exploit, roll up a flank, etc. During World War II, or during the innovative years, the 20s and 30s, we'll start looking at how aircraft can support amphibious landings. During the Second World War, we'll continue to do that. But the primary mission of Marine aviation in the Second World War is to be part of the defense, almost an element of the defense battalions that Chris Blaker mentioned here. Marines would seize an island. They'd bring in aircraft after the island was declared clear. To seize that island, we used predominantly some Marine Corps aircraft and pilots, but predominantly Navy from off the carriers. Marine aircraft squadrons would come in, and as the Marines are preparing to seize the next island, from that island 20 miles out, the island that's been seized and declared secure, from that island to 20-25 miles out, Marine aircraft would fly combat air patrols, kind of linked in with the defense battalions. Marines on the ground would pick up and go forward and use naval aircraft to seize the next island. The next island is seized, those squadrons would move forward, Marine squadrons, and start doing the combat air patrols again. So there isn't the nice, tidy package that we know from the Korean War on, where you have Marines talking on the ground directly to Marine aircraft and identifying a target. But we will slowly build up to that because we're getting smarter on how to use the toys that we have available. In addition to that, we're recognizing that we have to be a self-sustaining force if we want to be seen as a separate service. Everyone is going to have to depend on everyone, don't get me wrong. But ultimately, when you're in the thick of the fight, you got to go into the fight with the toys that you have. The Marine Corps will recognize that at the end of World War II. Korea was our first real test of the Marine Air Ground Task Force. Vietnam, we really perfected. Today, nobody does it the way we do it. So, and I'll hand it off to the distinguished group. Dr. Swanson, you want to jump on that one?
Yeah, if you've seen the movie Flying Leathernecks with John Wayne, he really oversells it. The vast majority, as Dr. was saying, the vast majority of assault support provided during the landings in the Central Pacific were by the Navy. And it's largely because of, as these units are growing vastly in size, the kind of habitual relationships that existed before the war could not exist during the war. For example, air groups before the war were associated with the aircraft carriers they came off of. So Air Group, Air Group 5 would be the USS Yorktown. After the war starts, those kind of habitual relationships don't last. So whatever aviation assets you have for a particular operation probably isn't what you worked with in the last operation. It was very difficult for them to do anything beyond really having pre-planned fires. So you're firing naval gunfire to 8 o'clock. From 8:05 to 8:25, you have aviation coming in and hit the beach. From 8:35, the naval gunfire starts again. Somebody on the ground with a radio calling up and calling for targets was very difficult, if not impossible, in most instances in World War II. And it was very exasperating for commanders on the ground, seeing aviation above. They did have some innovation, though. For example, in the Battle of Tinian, the beaches were so narrow that it was difficult for the coxswains to be able to see how to aim to get to the beaches. So they had Army P-47s that had flown off of Navy escort carriers to land on the airfield, Oswego Airfield in Saipan, flying to Tinian and just flying back and forth in the perimeters of where the boats were supposed to go in. The real innovation and the creation of a MAGTF with habitually related aviation and ground assets and logistic assets is something that comes after World War II. Everything in World War II was around the division. The division was, the infantry division was the supporting. Just to give you an idea of how important that was, a full-up Marine Corps division in World War II was something like 20,000, which is about twice the size of what normal divisions were in Europe at the time, for example. One last thing I'll say, kind of related to both of these questions, is that the United States has an advantage because it's a liberal culture and puts a lot of value on the individual. The idea of the United States, for example, using kamikazes never came up. It wasn't serious. That even something like the Doolittle raid meant that the guys are going to come back, or at least there's a chance that the guys are going to come back. And that leads to learning through the war. So Japanese commanders are trying to learn how to defend islands against Marine assaults. They're all dead at the end of the battle. They don't go back to Japan and teach people about what they learned. They learn a little bit over radio transmissions up to the point where they lose radio communications. But the fact that the United States places value on the individual, that rotates these individuals and units out of the battle, brings them back to school, meant that they were learning at a much better rate than the Japanese were learning during the war.
Yeah, the only thing I add is all the battles in the Pacific were fought for control of airfields, starting with Guadalcanal all the way up through Iwo Jima. And as a side note, you know, one of the things I get out, let me use the European theater example. What you always hear about the air war over Germany and the focus being on industrial targets. Well, if you look at the landings in Italy, at Salerno and at Anzio, we didn't have air superiority. At Anzio, the fleet had to disperse at night. When the Germans started using guided missiles launched from planes that were taking cruisers out because they had to go back and be refitted. By 1944, the time of the Normandy landing, because the Air Force kind of shifted its priority from industrial targets to going after the transportation infrastructure in France, they had warned the German Air Force enough where air superiority by Normandy wasn't a problem. But what you see really clearly in the Pacific is there's a definite connection between the naval service, the troops on the ground, both Army and Marine, and the air. They're all integrated, they don't need each other. And unfortunately, what you tend to see, especially after the war, is the Air Force, once it's created, assumes it can win the war by itself without anybody else's help. We don't need anything but an Air Force. And I think that's where we start running into trouble.
Just something quick to add. Good. Thank you. Stretch over you. And I'll just add very quickly that as the Marines were developing this larger than it had ever been air arm, you have a situation where your Marines on the ground and your Marines in the air are almost two separate bodies. What's fascinating is you can trace very clearly the path of the 6 Marine divisions through the Pacific, right through the South, through the Central, into the Western and Northern Pacific, approaching Japan. But you have Marine air elements that are operating in different theaters, are operating under different commands. Very few ground Marines participated, for instance, in the retaking of the Philippines in 1944 and 1945. There were artillery units that were under MacArthur, but you had a lot of Marine aviation in that campaign. And so, as historians and general enthusiasts of World War II, I think it is important to remember that these Marine air elements were fighting on different fronts and in different capacities too. It sort of expands the breadth of the Marine Corps' involvement in the Pacific War to add those aviation elements.
I'll add to that the whole idea about integrating Marine ground with Marine aviation becomes a central focus of the Marine Corps after the war, simply because we are looking at a situation where the services are trying to absorb the Marine Corps. It's the defense unification period where the Army and the Navy post-World War II, and really this happens even before we touch down on Okinawa, back in Washington, D.C., started to make the determination that after the war, we probably don't need a Marine Corps. Even after everything the Marines have done during the war, we probably don't need a Marine Corps. The Marine Corps formulate its defense via the Chowder Society, which was a collective group of Marines that roamed the halls of Congress to petition and politic and say, you still need us. You don't need to dissolve the Marine Corps and have the Army or the Navy absorb us. There is a need for the Marine Corps. And one of the arguments we will make is we will be the only service that is capable of conducting its own air-ground operations. We won't need support from the Navy. We won't need support from the Army Air Corps, which will become the Air Force. We can do it all of ourselves. And the number one argument that the Navy and the Army will not be able to defeat is during the amphibious assault, when naval ships have to pull back in the event that the enemy sends their fleet in to disrupt, or their aircraft, or they have defense battalions. The U.S. Navy will be pushed off. It'll provide naval gunfire support, but eventually will get pushed off. What is going to be the Marine Corps' primary fire support platform at that point? Artillery. We tried it during World War II, bringing artillery ashore on landing craft and having them shoot in support of Marines coming ashore onto the beach. Very inaccurate, very deadly. Can't be done. It's just not good. The Navy ships have left. We have no more naval gunfire support. The Marines' argument will be the replacement of naval gunfire and artillery in the amphibious assault is the Marine aviator. And that will be the primary argument that saves the Marine Corps' neck after the war, and it's what we still argue to this day. The very argument of separating Marine ground with aviation units was argued in Afghanistan between the senior Marine commander, which was General Tulin, and this goes back to about 2009, 2010 timeframe. Marine 3-star General Tulin will go toe-to-toe with the Army General Stanley McChrystal, because General McChrystal wants to pull Marine aircraft away from the Marine force in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. And the Marine Corps will argue, you can't. The Marine Corps is not the force that it is mandated to be without an air-ground team. And it'll go all the way up to the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Gates. And Gates will say, Army, Marine Corps, you work it out amongst yourselves. I'm not getting in the middle of this. And the Marine Corps says, over our dead body, you won't get our aircraft. And we're still doing that. Now, General Berger has kind of walked back a little bit and said, we need to be more innovative. We're still going to enforce Marine air-ground relationships, but we're not going to take it all the way to the point where you have 2 4-stars throwing punches in the Pentagon. So, next question. Who's got what? Yes, sir.
So I'd like to look at the Solomon Island campaign on what you talked about, Guadalcanal, the Cactus Air Force
Yeah.
that the Marines had, and then the naval actions and the sounds with the Marines trying to hold the ground, and how that wasn't necessarily nested together, or were these kind of separate actions? Because
Yeah.
the Navy gets a bad rap of leaving the Marines, which we know is maybe a bit of a misnomer.
Yeah, that great point. So Guadalcanal is the first Marine action of the war. You know, saved the defense of Eva Field in Hawaii. The first real ground action for the Marine Corps post Pearl Harbor is going to be Guadalcanal. And if you look on a map, and unfortunately we didn't pull a map up, Guadalcanal sits way down in the southern portion of the Pacific. It's part of the Solomon Islands. You can go from Guadalcanal, hop, skip, and a jump over to Papua New Guinea, and the next thing you know, you're in Australia. And that was the furthest advance of the Japanese ground forces. So to start the Pacific campaign, the goal is we have to build up combat power in the Pacific before we can really do anything. What do I mean by combat power? Got to get the fleet in, we've got to get supplies in, we've got to get our aircraft in, we've got to get our men and material in, postured and positioned to then start to move north, ejecting the Japanese off these different islands. Oh, by the way, those islands have aircraft or have runways, airfields, etc. The key to understanding the Pacific is that theater of war is a logistics intensive theater of war. You have to build up men and material, then you have to go into the attack, and then you have to replenish men and material, and then you have to look for islands that support deep anchorage, so you can pull ships up, so you can offload aircraft, men, and material. For those that you don't, you need to have a capable runway. Guadalcanal has a Japanese runway that's already under construction. And if we're going to bring our forces in, the first place we need to go to is Guadalcanal. That creates a buffer between the Japanese Empire and Australia. We don't want to fight on the mainland of Australia. That would be ugly. Okay, if the Japanese reach that, we're going to have problems. So Guadalcanal is identified as the first location where we're going to start, commence our South Pacific drive in order to then jump to the Central Pacific. The airfield there, which we will later name Henderson Field, is not fully built, but it's getting there. When the Marines land in August of '42 at Guadalcanal, and you've seen that on the Pacific, the Marine version of Band of Brothers, the Tom Hanks and Spielberg direction on HBO. That's the first landing, is at Guadalcanal. Once we seize the airfield, our primary goal is to make sure that airfield does not fall back under control of the Japanese. We start bringing in different aircraft, Marine Corps aircraft, Navy aircraft, Army Air Corps, and we develop what we call the Cactus Air Force. It's under the command of a Marine general named Roy S. Geiger, who was one of our original aviators. The 1st Marine Division is the ground force that lands there. 1st Marine Division is overall in control, and Geiger reports to Van de Grift, who is the commanding general of the 1st Marine Division, but he's also got his own mission. He's to provide air support in support of the fleet. He's supposed to provide support in support of the Marines on the ground. So they're almost operating autonomously, but like good Marines, we always come together and figure it out. What you need to look at Guadalcanal as is the way the Marine Corps did. It's the unsinkable aircraft carrier. That airfield is large enough to bring in quite a few aircraft and bring in a lot of supplies. We'll build 2 other airfields later on during the Guadalcanal campaign and during the course of the World War II. But ultimately, we look at airfields aboard islands as unsinkable carriers. That means we can bring in aircraft, we can refuel them, send them right back up. We can bring in supplies, we can bring in more Marines, we can take casualties out. Now, while everything is going ashore during the Guadalcanal campaign that lasts 6 months, takes us right into the beginning of 1943, there will be a series of naval battles that occur off the coast of Guadalcanal. The Navy gets a bad rap. The initial weeks that the Marines are ashore, it's actually the initial days, but really the initial weeks that the Marines are ashore, the Japanese fleet, the Imperial fleet, comes south to meet the U.S. fleet and to stop our seizure of Guadalcanal, to put pressure on our fleet and try to divert them away. You divert the fleet away from Guadalcanal, where you chase it off. Now the Marines are sitting ducks. They can't get supplies, they can't get reinforcements, they can't get casualties out, they can't retreat if given the direction to do so. They're sitting ducks. There's also several thousand Japanese troops that are ashore that have run off to the jungles to fight more or less a jungle campaign. Without the Navy fleet there, the U.S. fleet, and the Imperial fleet there, the Japanese forces that are ashore, they've got it made. They can reinforce, resupply, evacuate, they can do whatever they want. The Marines are now isolated. Because of that, the Marines will face a Japanese naval gunfire and air attack on a daily basis. And there will be a mortal divide between Marine and Navy leaders in that the Navy left us hanging. You left the 1st Marine Division ashore without any support. And matter of fact, the Navy left so quickly in the first couple of days of the Marine landing at Guadalcanal in August of '42. They left so quickly that the Marines didn't even get all of their people and equipment ashore. So you've got several thousand Marines that will be on these ships. The fleet will move back out into the big Pacific Ocean, and all the reinforcements and supplies that the Marines will need are stuck out there. So when a Marine gets killed on Guadalcanal, he ain't getting replaced. When a Marine gets sick because of malaria, he ain't getting replaced. We start eating Japanese rations that we capture on the island. stores of rice and fish and everything else. We will have more than 1,000 Marines that will go down with malaria. I mean, it's the number of Marines that will die and number of sailors that will die ashore at Guadalcanal because of malaria, malnutrition, etc. Incredible. But let's not kick the Navy in the teeth too much. The Navy has to move out, and there's reasons for that, and that's where I'll hand it off to our experts.
Yeah, just briefly, the U.S. Navy loses 3 killed for every Marine or soldier that's lost in the Battle of Guadalcanal. The Navy's fighting, it's just not fighting that well in the beginning. In the interwar period, the focus of the United States Navy was gunnery. There was a study done after the Spanish-American War, where even though the United States won it, they found out that the U.S. Navy gunnery was extraordinarily inaccurate. In fact, it was almost an accident if you actually hit something with it. So the Navy puts a lot of effort in this period to refine naval gunfire, not only improve the quality of the weapon systems, but especially fire control systems. And at this time, optically calibrated fire control systems. If you go up to Washington, D.C., and you drive by the Navy Yard, you'll see one building that's higher than any of the others, and it has glass all the way around. That's a building that in the 1920s and 1930s, the Navy used to calibrate their fire control systems. They developed a electromechanical computer called literally Ford Instrument Mark I that was used on battleships and cruisers for long-range naval gunnery. They developed another system similar on submarines for torpedoes. But the Navy puts all of its eggs in the baskets of long-range naval gunfire in the 1930s. Just as an example of that, they figure out that if they could take out a Japanese cruiser at 20,000 yards, which is far beyond the range of a torpedo, why would we need torpedoes on our cruisers? So they take torpedoes off of all of the heavy cruisers and almost all of the light cruisers. Now, in the 1930s, when we're exercising War Plan Orange with these fleet exercises, the Japanese are watching this. It's not a secret. It's in the newspaper. It's in magazines. It's in newsreels. The Japanese develop based on what we're doing. So if we're doing long-range naval gunfire, what do they want to do? They want to get close, grab us by the belt buckle, and fight us in confined waters at night with low visibility, where it takes out the advantage that we have with our their optics are actually better, but our computers are much better than theirs, because it gives you a constant firing solution. Theirs don't. So when we end up fighting night battles in confined waters in Guadalcanal, the Navy has to adopt different tactics. And what they eventually figure out, which they should have figured out before the war, is if you can couple radar instead of optical rangefinders and optical instruments, and then tie that into the fire control system, you've got a real war winner. But they didn't know that. They didn't understand that. And if you read a number of recent books on that, you see it's often the more junior officers that understand the new technology that's coming in, and the more senior officers who know how they've been fighting for years, they don't understand the new technology, and they don't make the best use of it. But the Navy does fight very hard. The commander that's there originally, the theater commander, is Admiral Gormley, who is a bit tentative. He's interested in force protection and keeping his ships safe. He's eventually relieved by Admiral Nimitz, and Admiral Halsey is much more aggressive. We lose. Even though we win the battle, we lose basically the same number of ships that the Japanese lose in the battle, and the same number of aircraft that the Japanese lose. And I'll close with this. Years ago, I was giving a paper on a similar topic at the National War College, and there were Japanese historians there, and they were from the equivalent of our war colleges and staff colleges, and they were Army and Navy. And guess what? They're still fighting over the Solomons, whether it was the Army, the Japanese Army that was to blame, or the Navy. The Army blames the Japanese Navy by saying, you didn't win control of the seas so that we could be resupplied. The Navy said to the Army, you didn't overrun Henderson Field so that we could get close. So as the United States is working closer and closer with joint operations, coalition operations during the war, the Japanese are not. In fact, when the Japanese Navy invades the Solomons in Guadalcanal and Talegi, the Japanese Army didn't even know it. They weren't brought into the discussion beforehand.
Kind of a different perspective on this, as you all probably know, the focus was not the Pacific in 1942. The focus was on Europe. And you probably also know the plan was in November 1942, Allied forces to include an American amphibious force led by General Patton that was coming from Norfolk, Virginia, all the way across the Atlantic. We're going to land in French Northwest Africa. That was the priority because we had to do something to get into the war in Europe to play a greater role. And one of the principal reasons for that was to show the Russians that we were supporting them. Also bear in mind, the Russians were not at war with the Japanese. They had some pre-war border skirmishes, but the Japanese and Russians did not go to war until the tail end of the war in 1945. The Russians were focused on fighting the Germans, and while the Russians were focused on fighting the Germans, the Japanese figured this would be a great opportunity to take over the British, French, and Dutch colonial empires in Asia. That's where we can get the national resources we need. So the focus for the United States initially was on supporting the war in Europe, 1942 by an invasion in Africa. Well, you had to do something, and one of the things that was hyped up with the Guadalcanal campaign is, hey, this is the first time we're throwing a punch back. I would argue that to a certain degree, the Guadalcanal campaign was launched, the nickname was, quote, Operation Shoestring, under budget, just as purely a morale booster and propaganda measure. Well, FDR himself, the President of the United States, realized that we had a full-scale fight on our hands and that we had to change our strategy and shift the resources to the Pacific that were needed to take on the Japanese. Another thing, by the way, FDR's son, Jimmy, was XO of the 2nd Raider Battalion on Guadalcanal. So how many times, not to be political, but when's the last time you saw the son of an American president in the Marine Corps in the middle of combat? So different war, different times. Now, let's take a quick look at the other Japanese perspective. Anybody ever heard of Ron Spector? He's an historian that's pretty famous for his knowledge of the Pacific War. And now I'm kind of dating myself, but back in the 90s, he came out with what was probably the definitive history of the Guadalcanal campaign based on Japanese sources. And I was listening on YouTube to a talk by Ron Spector one time. Guess what Japanese intelligence thought the United States was going to do in 1942? Send aircraft to Siberia so they could bomb Japan. The last thing they expected was us to launch an amphibious assault and try to recapture Guadalcanal. And guess what happened to the Japanese colonel that made that prediction? They sent him to Guadalcanal as a reward for guessing wrong. So both sides can make a mistake, and I guess I want to leave you here is the Pacific was not the priority. But one of the things that taught the Allied leaders, particularly the United States, is we cannot underestimate the Japanese. We can't focus exclusively on Europe. And also, one of the things, if you look at Japanese sources and Japanese self-assessments of the results of the Guadalcanal campaign, they knew after 6 months of a knockdown, drag them out, fight on land, sea, and air, they were not going to win the war. From that point on, they were going to have to fight to get the best deal they could get at a peace conference. And they knew that by the time the Guadalcanal campaign ended. They will say that themselves.
And adding to that, I'll say that Guadalcanal was a tight battle. Historian Samuel L. Morrison describes it as the most, I believe, bitterly contested campaign of any war since the Northern Virginia campaign of the American Civil War. It's really the first and maybe last instance of World War II where you have such an evenly matched opposing forces fighting for such a small part of land. Going off of that, you could say that there are 5 great aircraft carrier battles of World War II: Coral Sea, Midway, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, and Philippine Sea. 2 of those 5 were fought within the confines of Guadalcanal, the Eastern Solomons and the Santa Cruz. Mentioned earlier when Admiral Gormley was in charge of the South Pacific, he was a very timid commander, was very more so concerned with keeping his ships safe, especially as we were losing ships. We lost either sunk or damaged 4 aircraft carriers during the Solomons campaign. And so it isn't until mid-October of 1942 when Halsey comes in as a replacement that you really start to see some big charges from the American Navy, and then in that sense sort of beginning to redeem themselves. And I'll share a story. I have an interesting Marine Corps connection. My grandfather was a seagoing Marine, and he actually served as Admiral Halsey's orderly. And so I've looked into a lot of these smaller Halsey stories. And right when Halsey took command of the South Pacific on the 18th of October 1942, shortly thereafter he met with General Vandegrift in New Caledonia. And Halsey asked Vandegrift, what's happening ashore? What can I help with? Bring me up to speed. And Vandegrift says, we're not getting what we need from the Navy. There are Army troops here on New Caledonia. Why aren't they on Guadalcanal? There are supplies here. There are ships in the harbor waiting here. Why aren't they coming to us? And apparently Halsey was incredibly embarrassed, shocked about this, that the Navy wasn't doing its part. He vowed to Vandegrift that he would do everything he could to make sure that the Marines had everything they needed. Within 2 weeks, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands had been launched. The Enterprise was damaged, the Hornet was sunk, and that effectively negated all of the U.S. Navy's aircraft carrier power in the Solomons. And so that's sort of when you push into the latter half of the campaign, where your cruisers, a few battleships, and your destroyers are doing a lot of the work in those naval campaigns. So I guess to summarize, it was absolutely tough sledding between the two services, the Marine Corps and the Navy, but I think that the Guadalcanal campaign really showed those growing pains and helped them solidify their services for future campaigns in the South, Central, Western, and Northern Pacific.
To add a piece of Guadalcanal as it projects to the future, and it kind of epitomizes what the Marine Corps does with its own history and kind of what our jobs as Marine Corps historians are to educate Marine officers on our history. During the Guadalcanal campaign, there is a major that will fight as a Marine Raider. His name is Walt. He's the XO of Raider Battalion that's fighting on Bloody Ridge. And his whole job forward of the airfield and his battalion's job is to make sure that they are early warning and they can potentially intercept the Japanese as they are moving to attack Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. And they will get into some really pitched battles. Walt will receive the Navy Cross there as a major. He'll go on, Navy Cross is second in the Medal of Honor. He'll go on to rise to the ranks of 4-star, the Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps, before he retires around the early 70s. But the long and short of it, as a 2-star general, Walt is in charge of all Marines that land in Vietnam, South Vietnam at Da Nang in March of 1965. The primary objective when the Marines land at Da Nang in March of 65 is to secure the airfield and the outlying areas to include the high ground. General Walt will look at the airfield at Da Nang and have flashbacks. He'll say it himself, I have flashbacks of Guadalcanal, 20-some years earlier. He will set up his defenses exactly the way they set them up at Guadalcanal, to protect Henderson Field at Da Nang, to protect the major Marine airfield there. He'll seize the high ground. He'll block enemy approaches. He'll do all the things, and he'll tell you, I did that because these are the things that we did at Guadalcanal. He will press upon the Navy off the coast throughout 1965 that, you need to stay right here and provide us with naval gunfire support when we need it. He'll press upon the Air Force. You need to be moving out further to shape enemy targets. We don't need massive communist forces moving up and seizing the high ground so they can then project fires on top of the Marines in the airfield at Da Nang. He literally fights that first year protecting Da Nang, the airfield at Da Nang, the way he would have, and in many ways the way he helped do at Guadalcanal in 1942. We invest in our history, all right, and he does it right. Next question. Yes, sir.
Sir, how did MacArthur convince command that we needed to take Palolo in his return to the Philippines?
Doc, you want to take that one?
That might be a case of inertia. He ends up rather indifferent toward it because he's not in the southern Philippines. And Halsey makes the point that the southern Philippines are not really a threat. But Nimitz decides that it's just the whole operation has gone so far forward it would be a problem to stop it. And to defend Nimitz here, they had thought that it would be pretty much a pushover. In fact, one of the reasons Peleliu is not well known, even though it's a bitter battle and really important in Marine Corps history, is because the Marine commander told the news media that it was only going to last 3 days, I think it was, he said. So they didn't bother to go ashore. So it's worthwhile to read like Eugene Sledge's book to understand the actual experience of the Marines that went there. And just some of the lessons learned. One of the problems the Marines had in the Pacific was a lot of these islands were volcanic. And as a result, they didn't have any water. So being able to get fresh water ashore was a huge problem. And Eugene Sledge was given the task of cleaning out 55-gallon drums from diesel fuel so that they could use them for water. And he finds out later, he doesn't do a very good job, he finds out later that a lot of Marines get sick from the diesel fuel. But I don't know, Admiral Nimitz is somebody that you could find a very hard time finding historians or especially staff who worked with him to say anything bad about him. Peleliu was, in retrospect, was a serious mistake. But given what he knew at the time, it wasn't an unreasonable decision that he made. One of the things that they're learning as the war's going on is you don't have to take every island. You don't have to take Rabaul. Leave those 100,000 Japanese troops to wither on the vine. You don't have to take Truk. Just surround it. And if you could dominate it with sea and air power, you can avoid that. That's a different from what they were thinking before the war. And it was actually governed almost by an arc that you could draw around an airfield that would be the distance of a B-24. So if you could station B-24s, Navy, Marine Corps, or Navy, Army, then you could dominate the force around it. The other thing is that these fleet anchorages are moving. The rule of thumb is a fleet loses 10% of its combat power every 1,000 miles it moves from its base. So you start measuring 1,000 miles from Bremerton or San Francisco or San Diego, you're losing combat power. So you've got to move the advanced logistics bases across the Pacific, so including things like floating dry docks or airfields built with Marston matting. When we take the Marianas, one of the first things that Nimitz does is he takes his staff from Hawaii and they move to Guam. And that makes the staff very happy in Hawaii, because Nimitz had a rule when he was there. He didn't want women sailors working for him. He said that he was raised to stand up when a woman came into the room, and he didn't like the fact that women stood up when he came in the room. So when Nimitz moved to Guam, they were allowed to have women on the staff in Hawaii.
I guess one thing I'd add, since you mentioned Peleliu, there's a big difference between the Solomons campaign, starting with Guadalcanal, and then the subsequent campaigns, for example, in the Marshalls and the Marianas. And the easy way to explain it, it's like, initially, oh, this is going to be just like the French and Indian War. Well, French and Indians, small number of French, small number of Indians, small number of colonists, big woods, right? Guadalcanal, small number of Americans, small number of Japanese, big island, big jungle. Then you get to Taro, small island, lots of Japanese, lots of Marines, lots of bullets, no rooms to duck. So, very, very different character of the war in the second half from the first half. It becomes much more of a mechanized war. And that's where concepts like air support, naval gunfire, using armor, using assault amphibious vehicles, so you get a ride on an armored vehicle across a coral reef instead of having walking for three-quarters of a mile. I had just a quick note. When I went to college, I had a professor that was a veteran of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian, and Okinawa. Every time the class met, he would either talk about Guadalcanal or Tarawa, often both. For years afterwards, I exchanged Christmas cards with him. Every time I got a Christmas card, he always worked in some kind of reference to Guadalcanal. And the reason I say that is we had another professor, an English professor, and we were doing Shakespeare. And, the play Henry V, they talk about the Battle of Agincourt. Well, being a Guadalcanal veteran, he, of course, had to compare Guadalcanal to the Battle of Agincourt. And the author, James Jones, the guy that wrote Thin Red Line, the perspective he gives on that is, you had a generation, the greatest generation had to struggle. They had trouble getting people enlisted or drafted because they were all underweight due to the Depression. So these people are used to tough times. And now they get stuck on this island with a relentless enemy and limited resources, and just like they struggled through those Depression years, they know they're gonna have to survive by their own wits, because there's no going back. So, again, very different type of fighting in the first half of the war and the second half of the war. In the second half of the war, a lot more firepower, a lot more mechanization, a lot less maneuver, and that's how you end up with bloody fights like Peleliu, because there's no other way to do anything except go up the middle.
You said it perfectly.
Next question? Anybody? We've kind of run to our hour, so you all are free to take off. If anyone wants to stay and ask us more questions, we're here until this place is empty.